So let's talk a little bit about the truth of diversity in the modern education classroom, particularly from what I've experienced here in the United States. I'm Dr. Christy Preddy-Franzak, and at Inclusive Schooling, we do all things inclusive, including providing professional development and training on hot topics, on things that are challenges, and provide you with tips and practical ideas to create more and more inclusive classrooms and schools. So let's dive in to what does diversity look like in the modern classroom? And what are some of the things that we're seeing at inclusive schooling that lead to exclusion instead of inclusion? For today's thought about what's going on in this classroom or in this educational environment, we're going to talk about this thing called presumption of competence. And believe it or not, even though I had been in special education and particularly early intervention, early childhood special education for decades, I rarely heard this phrase until I started working with Dr. Julie Costin at Inclusive Schooling. This notion that every time we turned a corner, she was inviting us to think about presuming competence. And it sort of was this nebulous term to me, or it was like, well, it was sort of maybe performative, like I'm just going to put rose-colored glasses on and I'm going to ignore that this student has some sort of needs. And sometimes when we act like, or it feels like we're acting like there isn't a problem or the student doesn't have needs, people are wanting to convince us they really do have needs. In fact, one time I was at an IEP meeting and we were a very strength-based program. And so we were talking to the family about their child's strengths. And the mom finally said, "Hey, friends, we know that he's cute. We know that he's got lots of great attributes. Can we get to the problem? Because we only have so much time and he has lots of problems." And I thought to myself, oh, but it's so much fun to sit here and talk about all the great things they're doing. And she's like, yeah, but I'm still carrying him. I'm still feeding him. I'm still changing his diaper. So let's get on with how we're going to fix it. But even parents, we don't always presume competence. How many of you are parents and your kids stayed the night over at a friend's house? When they got dropped back off, the parent said to you, "They were an angel. They were so great. We'll have them anytime." Even if you don't have kids and you take your dog somewhere and they say, "Oh, your dog, we love them." And you're like, "You do? Are you sure?" You're not presuming confidence. So presuming confidence for me is really saying, okay, regardless of your label, regardless of my history with you, regardless of maybe even what you're doing right now in front of me, I'm going to assume or presume that you are capable. I'm going to presume that there are abilities that are yet untapped. I'm going to presume that with the right scaffolding and support, you can be successful versus writing something off as they will never, they can't, they won't, they aren't. Okay. So it's sort of like possibility, hopeful, they might, and it's sort of maybe pie in the sky, but we're saying that is the viewpoint, the mindset we're coming from. Now, let's say that makes any sense to us, okay? In most classrooms, we don't presume competence. We're always looking for deficits. We're always looking for who's failing, who's off the mark, who's not meeting a standard. Now, we don't always say it that way. We're like, who's struggling? Who needs more support? Who needs an intervention? And so our intention is good, but the impact is often not so good. So let's talk about intention versus impact, because what often happens when we don't presume competence is we become ableist, or we start having ableist mindsets, heart sets, and ableist practices. So then you might be going, well, what is ableist? Well, you can Google it, certainly. You can have conversations with folks. There's many different definitions. There's even very common ways of thinking what is ableist. For me, it goes back to that intention versus impact. So let's stay on my intention for a minute. So let's even take something as simple as, should I say a student is some sort of label or not? So let's use autism. Should I say that a student is autistic? Should I say a student has autism? Should I worry about using the word autistic around them? Should I be concerned about telling a family that their child is autistic? Okay, so if you get that, if you have a feeling about, yes, I have struggled, I've wondered, I'm not sure. So for me, ableist thinking is there implicitly, like subconsciously or consciously, when we worry that a particular word or phrase or practice is going to be demeaning or negative, or maybe even offensive. If our mindset is it's offensive to call someone autistic, that is ableist mindset. That is a belief that I think somehow being autistic is less than or a problem. And therefore, I'm worried about telling a parent that their child is being diagnosed with that, or I don't want to offend someone by calling them or using a label inappropriately, because I think that label has negative connotations. Okay. In an ableist society, autism does come with negative connotations because in an ableist society, we are thinking anything that is not what we would call typical. And many would say autism is atypical or neurodiverse or neurodivergent. Sometimes we come up with other labels that haven't yet created the baggage that other labels have. But still, in our mind, in our heart, we're saying, oh, you're not the same as the norm or what is typical or what is good. Now, you might say, well, I don't think I'm having those thoughts. I think it's negative. I have a son with autism and I love my son. Or I think, right, it's pervasive. It doesn't make you a bad person. It just means that we have to dismantle a lot of our intentions or our mindset, because the impact of that ableist thinking is that we see the dominant group, and it doesn't mean the majority, just means the dominant, the ones with the power, are saying the best way to show up is to use verbal speech. The best way to show up is to read at this level, at this age, in this way. So what happens is the dominant standard or benchmark becomes what we compare all humans to. And if you don't meet that dominant benchmark or standard or ideal, then we start to exclude. We start to say, you might need something different in a different place, in a different way, with different materials, with different people. And we start to create exclusion. Now, can people of a particular identity, let's stay with autism, if I self identify as autistic, can I find other people who identify as autistic and form a club, join a group, make a private Zoom meeting, have a Facebook group, have a Pinterest board? Absolutely, right? We can get together, we can affiliate based upon our own identities. It's when someone looks at me and decides based upon a label they're giving or that we've jointly agreed upon that I'm going to get something different. And it's usually from a deficit perspective. It's thinking that I need to be fixed, I need to have remediation, I need to become more like the dominant ideal or dominant expectation. So basically, when we go all the way back to the presumption of competence, we are losing that medical model. We are moving away from this deficit orientation that thinks there's something wrong with the student because they're doing something differently. Could be a different pace, different timing, different process, different mode. It doesn't mean that because of those differences, there's an absence of need of support. Absolutely. I still need support to build my skills, build my independence and my interdependence, to build the things that I want to be able to accomplish and the goals that I want to seek. And to be honest, we still have an ableist society. The dominant way that buildings are created, schools are structured, jobs and money are aligned, housing is given, are absolutely along the lines of people who are abled, as well as people who are white, as well as people who are cisgender, as well as people who speak English. Those are the dominant cultures. Those are the identities that have power. So a person with a disability who's also Black, who doesn't speak English, has three things that are going to be created barriers just purely because of the dominant culture. Not anything wrong with those three identities, except for when you try to exist in a dominant culture that sees those as negative, bad, problematic, then there will become things that harm you, things that marginalize you, things that limit you, things that exclude you. So, all the way back to autism. If I have that label given to a student, and when they become old enough, and or for their family, if they accept that label, it can be something that we start to presume as anyone else, they're going to have competence. As with anyone else, they may or may not qualify for certain jobs. As with anyone else, they may or may not excel at certain subject areas. As with anyone else, they may or may not excel at certain languages or arts or in the sports, right? Because all of us are different. So, in a modern classroom, when we think of diversity, we're thinking about we're all going to be good at some things and not so good at other things. And the goal isn't to make everybody who's not so good at stuff at least average. Like, I am not so good at golf, and I don't need to be average at golf to sort of be happy in my life. And you might say, well, golf is a choice. Reading, math, meeting graduation requirements, not a choice. But when we think about a modern education classroom, are we really preparing kids just for tests, or are we preparing them for a life where they get to make choices, have a sense of agency, create friendships, and have some sort of meaningful existence? That, for me, is the heart of the question. What is the purpose of education?